So guys, it's 7:01. I feel like Japan Society, we got to start on time. Although I know that we're targeting contemporaries, which means young professionals, which we're always running a little bit behind the curve. But I just wanted to get an opportunity to say thank you to everyone joining. I'm Joshua Walker at Japan Society. I'm really excited for this event in particular. Our team has been talking about this. I can't tell you the amount of excitement that this has generated for us. I think I was talking right before we went live with Ren and a few others that basically sometimes you may not think about Japan Society and finding the global rap star in Japan as going together. I think Japan Society, when you think about musical genres, maybe more on the classical side than it is on the hip hop side. But I'm hoping that you all can help us. I really am looking to all of you, not just our participants who are our great panelists today to talk about this amazing topic, but also all of you joining us viewing today, because I think that one of the things we at Japan Society are most interested in doing is thinking about the next generation. I think as we've gone through this pandemic, we've realized what's important to us and thinking about what the future looks like. We're celebrating our 50th year of our building this year. We need to think about the next 50 years. You know, before this pandemic, we didn't do very much anything on virtual space. We did everything in our beautiful building. I hope we get a chance to meet there again. Today's topic, I think, is self-explanatory. I can't wait to get into it. And any of you that have joined have heard us talking about it. But the title is great. Looking for the next global rap star in Japan. I can't wait to talk to our speakers today. But what you're a part of is the inaugural launch of 333 Contemporaries. 333 is actually our address, 333 47th Street. We're right across from the UN. We want to really engage young patrons who are in their 20s and 30s, young professionals who have a deep affinity for Japan and Japanese culture through a new series of curated annual events and programs. Contemporaries encourages a community of like-minded individuals like yourselves to come together to continue Japan Society's mission with the next generation. Obviously, we're doing this virtually because we're in the middle of a pandemic. Until we all get vaccines, I can't wait to welcome you at our landmark building. We've already joked about doing a Japanese rap off at the Japan Society, which would just be amazing. So some of the artists that are represented tonight, we hope we get a chance to do that in hybrid reality with digital programming. So with that, I'm going to step back, hand this over to the panel, and learn like the rest of you all. I'm going to introduce our moderator, who's Patrick St. Michael. Patrick is a writer based in Tokyo who covers Japanese music, pop culture, and so much more. If you read his writings, you'll see it in the Japan Times, like I've seen many times before, Pitchfork and The Atlantic, and so much more. So with that, Patrick, let me hand this great conversation over to you all and say thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Dr. Walker. And yeah, thank you everybody tuning in tonight, wherever you are. So tonight we are going to be talking to the Frank Renaissance crew about finding the next global Japanese rap superstar. So I wanted first to introduce everyone from Frank Renaissance. So I guess I'll pass it off to Ren. First off, if you could give a quick intro.
Sure. Thanks for the intro, Patrick, and thank everybody for joining. Really excited about this opportunity. I'm one of the co-founders of Frank Renaissance. I'm half Japanese, actually born and raised in New York. Ended up going to Japanese school in Queens every Saturday throughout my childhood, and grew up going back and forth between the US and Japan. But I've been based in Tokyo for the last 4 years. I've been a big hip hop fan since day one. You know, my first concert ever was at the Apollo. My godmother used to work there, and so saw a pretty legendary first rap concert at the Apollo in 7th grade back in the day. But over these last few years have been, heavily involved in, culture exchange and business exchange as well between Japan and the US. Have helped bring Carnegie Hall's music education programs to Japan. Have also worked with Japanese fine artists, specifically one named Mitsumasa Kadota, bringing him for his first show to New York at Lincoln Center. I also work in BC as well. I work at a BC firm called SIP Global Partners, investing in US high growth tech companies, bringing them to Japan. But no matter what I've been doing, sort of been involved in sort of connecting the US and Japan, and I think gotten involved with the hip hop scene in Japan since I've landed here over the last 4 years, and formally launched the Frank Renaissance entity with Frankie this past June. So that's myself.
Thanks, Ren. I'm Frankie Caracciolo, a co-founder here of Frank Renaissance. Frankie Renaissance, not quite the same sort of ring to it, but Ren and I mentioned, sort of went to college together, lived together for a bit in Brooklyn after that before Ren went to Tokyo. And while he was there, he talked a lot about hip hop in there. And so we'll get to sort of like how Frank Renaissance came to be, but like our shared sort of passion for and love of hip hop starts in New York. I grew up in Queens, and still live in New York here. I was a freelance writer in the past. I worked on like page 6 of the New York Post. But currently for the last few years, I've worked for a digital marketing agency that's sort of rooted in culture first sort of experiences, and music and in particular hip hop and sort of related genres is very key to it in terms of like who we speak to, the events we sort of put together. And we do that both here in New York, but across the country, and some international work as well. I think Kayvan, and Aya, Ren, and sort of maybe many people sort of attending here can speak about growing up in the US, but also like where that sort of love and interest of Japanese culture comes from. And it does start with many through, say, anime or food style, and eventually it came to music as well. And so I think there was a lot of sort of natural shared sort of beyond our sort of like friendship, like between what our work and our passions that brought sort of Ren and I together to create Frank Renaissance.
Go ahead, Kayvan.
I don't mind either way. We did this last time too. I wasn't sure.
We did.
I'm Kayvan Daragheh. I was born in the UK. My mom's Chinese. My dad's Iranian. I'm kind of from everywhere. I like a lot of things from a lot of different places. And first and foremost, I really am just a fan of music and hip hop specifically from all over the globe. So that's kind of how I got into this with Ren, Frankie, and Aya as well. Just being a fan of music. My day job, I'm the artist relations director at Genius. So I do a lot of, interviews with artists and stuff like that, and book talent as well for a lot of our series. And so my job there has required me to do a lot of research, specifically on YouTube into music, not only from the US, but from the rest of the world too, just to kind of be on top of what's happening globally. And so that also kind of led me to being a really big fan of Japanese hip hop. Outside of that, I manage artists, I produce as well. So I come from the creative side first, and that is kind of how I got into this as an A&R consultant. Creating music and making art that will impact people is really just my end goal. Like, it's something I love to do and something that I want to be able to do. And being able to do that with artists from the US and artists from Japan, and figuring ways to do that on a global scale is definitely like at the top of my list. So this has definitely been like a really, really cool opportunity to work with artists who might not necessarily fully understand what they're saying, but can feel what they're getting across, and really enjoy that as well. So that's a little bit about me. I'll pass off to Aya.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks Japan Society for having us here today. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Aya. I am a creative producer at Frank Ren. I'm born and raised in New York. I've actually taken classes through the Japan Society before, but grew up coming to Tokyo. I've now been based here in Tokyo, where it's 8 a.m. For 5 years. And here I work in the creative and ad industry as a copywriter, translator, and producer, which I think seems like quite a lot, but the major theme of it all is that basically I build cultural bridges between Japan and the US, whether that's in more literal ways like through language, or broader ways like helping Japanese brands go global, or helping Japanese brands collaborate with international creatives, which I think really ties into the work we do at Frank Renaissance. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today and to tell you more about what we do.
Thank you all for the intros. And I think that's a good jumping off point to talk a bit more about what Frank Renaissance is and how it came to be. Ren, if you could sort of give us a little bit of the backstory of how this project came to be.
Sure. So Frank Renaissance, to put it in a single sentence, is a record label and production studio, bringing Japanese hip hop artists to a global stage. And we're doing this specifically by curating these artists with our sort of dual native team who fully understands sort of what is authentic in Japan and what is cool and accessible overseas, to curate these artists for a broader audience than just the domestic audience. And we do this with a focus on collaborations, especially specifically working with US musicians, designers, and brands to create new entry points. The language and cultural barriers we know are significant between Japanese artists and global audiences. And so by creating these entry points through curation and different collaborations with the US, we're hoping to make this Japanese sort of generation of hip hop artists more accessible. And within this, we firmly believe that the way that the Japanese hip hop scene is constructed today and this current generation of artists has the potential to have significant both domestic and international success. And so could get into that right now, but I think we have a lot to go over today, and so we'll leave that for a little bit later. In terms of how Frank Renaissance came about, I personally had listened to Japanese hip hop here and there growing up, but didn't really know much about it until I got here about 4 years ago, a little over 4 years ago or so. And this is a little bit millennial of me to some extent, but really how I got introduced to Japanese hip hop was really going down sort of a rabbit hole of YouTube videos, watching a lot of the different artists that were coming about at the time, and just realizing how much sort of diversity and richness and talent there was with a lot of the artists coming out, and seeing sort of to be sort of quite frank, and how cool these artists were. Especially this was right at the beginning of 88 Rising, and you weren't really seeing any Japanese or Asian artists at that on a global stage. And so to be able to see all of this sort of pent up creativity and talent in Japan was just really inspiring. And I decided to go to my first show on my own. And when I got to the show, there was an artist who I was a big fan of at the time named Wenny Dasilio. He's a half Japanese, half Filipino rapper. So just sitting on the stoop outside the show, and I go up to him and say, "Hey, are you Wenny?" And he goes, "Yeah, oh, and in fact I am. Nice to meet you." And we end up becoming friends at the show, and end up going to a few of his shows later. And just with how sort of tightly knit the hip hop community was, or still is, I guess, to this day in Japan, by proxy became part of this community and became close with a lot of the artists who were starting to become popular at the time. And I think what was really, especially just as a fan, being able to be a part of this community, even just as a fan, was really unique, and something that was particularly inspiring. And through my work as well, connecting Japan and the U.S., started to think about how can we sort of create this cultural bridge. How can we bring these artists to a global stage? And speaking to the artists as well, they kind of fell into two broader camps of, you have these artists who love American hip hop and want to go overseas yesterday. And then you have the second bucket of artists who felt that, and still feel that, sort of the natural progression of their success was eventually to do something overseas, and specifically in the US. And so, started to talk to Frankie about some of the artists that were coming out of Japan over the last few years, and he's the cultural expert in the U.S. And so midway through 2019, he came to Japan to sort of check out what was going on himself, and that sort of got us thinking. If we work together, we might really be able to create this bridge. And it's something that I've been doing in a bunch of different forums prior to then, and so started to plan our first campaign and track release, which ended up releasing last November. We ended up collaborating with a US-based designer named Ren Stern, who coincidentally is also my cousin. But we ended up releasing that track with a merch release sort of together in the US and Japan at the end of last year. And then ended up pairing up with sort of Kayvan and Aya as well, sort of really to sort of scale this vision of bringing in these US artists and being able to produce content to shrink the culture gap and language gap between sort of the Japanese artists and the US. And so, I think especially today in sort of this post-COVID world, there's two things. There's first thing, especially as artists are recording remotely, an artist in New York, an artist in LA, an artist in New York, an artist in Tokyo collaborating on a track, there isn't necessarily a huge difference from an operational perspective. And also in a world without bookings, there's demand both, from the Japan side and the US side alike to explore these new market opportunities. And so, we released our first track next year. We have more coming out in the next 2 to 3 months. We should have a few tracks out in the market, a few more tracks out in the market, and so we're at the very beginning here, but we're hoping to push this forward into 2021.
I wanted to elaborate. I wanted to ask Frankie actually a bit more about why he feels Japanese hip hop has the potential to have more mainstream international success in the future. I'm especially curious, you went to Japan in 2019. What did you see on that trip that sort of like maybe sort of hinted at this potential? Was there any memories from that that made you really believe that this was a possibility?
It's a sort of great question, because the trip ended up being very fortuitous. I mean, it's got us to this moment right here, but after Ren moved to Japan in 2016, he would talk about his time there, and eventually a lot of the conversation would talk about all the sort of hip hop shows he was going to, and the sort of lifestyle there and the energy. And I didn't really need like a reason to want to travel to Japan, but definitely wanted to visit Ren and see the Tokyo and sort of travel around a bit. And so when I did, the trip ended up being so much more. And that I mean, coincidentally, like I also, the first time I met Wendy Desilio was outside of a Lawson's, so it's similarly, it's the same trip where I met Aya, and we had gone to some hip hop shows together, and I was so like impressed and taken by the sort of how much of what I loved about New York culturally here and the lifestyle here was apparent in Japan. It's very different, but there was a huge metropolitan setting, this sort of lifestyle, and sort of like then seeing how hip hop was growing and sort of manifesting there. Meeting Wendy outside of a Lawson, but then also going to the shows and meeting the rappers there, and in a way it was like similar to what I was sort of working on and doing and sort of writing and sort of in my day job back in New York, but like with a bit more of like a immediate connectedness. Like these were just kids who I also like wanted to hang out, and that there wasn't like as a sort of more internet driven and grassroots genre there, it wasn't yet sort of like with all the sort of barriers in place that it would take to really be hanging out with the sort of established hip hop artists back in the States. And so I saw these sort of connections and, came back to the States after that first trip and really wanted to do something and really sort of began to like more fully ingratiate myself with the genre and exploring it and listening to all these sort of artists from, not just this current generation, but going back to like Buddha Brand and so on. And what I saw was that like the language barrier, of course, is still remains to be like the largest barrier for crossover success, but that the parallels were too strong to sort of ignore. And we saw like the passion and sort of love that these artists have in Japan, that like we could see like it was like this feeling of like if you just listen to it, you would really dig it. And what can we do to sort of really exemplify and showcase that? And that's what our conversations were around. And we saw the changing sort of media and music landscape both here in America and in Japan, with streaming becoming much like noticeably more nascent in Japan, and in the way that it's exploded really here in the States, and saw there was opportunity to create a sort of label that did something different and tapped into that feeling and memories that like both Ren and I sort of like had on that trip to Japan.
Thank you so much. I wanted to go to Kayvan next. Your position at Genius, I think it's safe to say, makes you an authority on all things hip hop. So I'm curious, I just wanted to hear, like, what do you think of Japanese hip hop since you've started working with Frank Renaissance? What's impressed you or stood out about rap music coming out of the country?
So I think the first time I really even heard any Japanese hip hop, coincidentally, like, as Ren was mentioning, was kind of around that start of 88 Rising and them becoming more of a force specifically on YouTube. A lot of my job at Genius is very YouTube related because that is kind of like our main platform for publishing content. And so, I kind of came into the job. Rob Markman is my boss. He is the authority on hip hop, if we're being completely honest. And so when I came in, for me, I like very quickly was like, all right, it doesn't really make sense for me to try and fill his space. Let me just see what I can do on my own and find all these different avenues of music that we can look at and be covering. And so, you know, it was pop and every other genre. And then I started to get really into like international music because I started to notice like, one, there is huge audiences on YouTube specifically for a lot of international markets, and then much bigger than the US market as well. Like just the way that artists release videos and the type of viewership that they get is absolutely just madness. And so when I think it was the Ichima remix came out, that was like my first experience with Japanese hip hop. I'd listened to, I was a big anime fan growing up, so you know I was listening to like Nightmare and like some of like the OST songs, and I'd kind of found my way into like more J-pop stuff and like baby metal, and so that was kind of like my first experience with Japanese music in general, and then more classical stuff because I was a violinist too. But then as we got, you know, as I found the Ichima remix and we got to Ko's verse.
Could you introduce the Ichima remix to maybe listeners who don't know what that is?
So there's an artist, he's a Korean rapper, his name's Keith Ape. He's actually going through some health issues right now, so prayers up for Keith Ape. But he released a song called Ichima that did really, really well on YouTube. I can't remember. I think the original, I can't remember if it was just him or not. Honestly, I don't really think anyone really talks about the original that much, but there's two remixes. He did a remix that was like all Asian artists from different markets. Ko was the only Japanese rapper on that song, I think, or on that version of it. But he was the one who stood out the most to me, if I'm being honest. I listened to all of them. I don't really speak any languages other than English, but to me, music is like it's like a visceral thing. Like you can really feel it, right? So even if you don't necessarily understand what's being said, a lot of times you can infer what the emotion behind something is or something like that. So for me, like Ko's verse just really was the one that stood out. And from there, I also kind of went into a rabbit hole on YouTube of just diving into Japanese hip hop. And then, you know, for the first little while, I think I was really just super into Ko, and I didn't really find anybody else that really like excited me that much. And then it was probably like a year and a half ago, like towards the end of us being like in our physical office space in Brooklyn, I just stumbled upon Hideyoshi's Maji Hashina, right? That's right. Stumbled upon that song.
Majina Hanashi.
There you go. I'm mispronouncing things.
Don't worry about it today. We're working
but I stumbled upon that song, and then I got super into that because I just really love this idea of Japanese hip hop being more trap and melodic trap inspired. I think if you look at it from like a very general standpoint, a lot of it does kind of lean more into that boom bap sound, which obviously on the US side isn't necessarily as popular anymore. And so, you know, I think to an extent it's dated the genre in Japan specifically as well, and outside of Japan just because of the sound. But with Hideyoshi, it was like the first instance where I was like, all right, there is something here that like if there are kids who are doing this from a visual standpoint as well, because the video was just, I mean, it was everything that you would see in an American hip hop video or in a UK based hip hop video, and it felt like, all right, this is like youth culture, and this is what the youth is like in Japan, and this is what city life is like in Japan as well. You know what I mean? I think those two things they're present in every aspect of hip hop across the globe. You know what I mean? Like if you look at hip hop artists and where they come from and like what they're inspired by in general, a lot of those stories are going to line up, and a lot of those experiences are going to line up. So I don't know. I think for me, like the allure of Japanese hip hop, one is that the language, we were talking about this at the beginning, the language is a super percussive language. And so it lends itself to the genre naturally. It sounds really, really good on hip hop beats because they are such structured pieces of music. And because it's like, you know, it's 16 bars or 8 bars. So it's usually in like sets, you know what I mean? Like when you look at production and stuff like that. So like from like a rhythmic standpoint, it just fits really, really well over hip hop production. I love that about the language. So I think it sounds really good. And I think that at the end of the day is the thing that people are looking for. Like it's going to be hard, obviously, with a language barrier to market hip hop to an English audience if it's not in English. But I think we've also seen over the last couple of years, the Korean rappers have managed to do it. 88 Rising has managed to do it with certain rappers. And I just think that like at the end of the day, like people don't necessarily understand that either in the US. People really like it and they enjoy to listen to it. And I just think that the Japanese language sounds so good on hip hop. That is the thing that draws me to it the most. I think it just really, really fits over the production and just lends itself to great art.
we've been talking a lot about Japanese hip hop in general so far, so I think it would be useful to take a step back and sort of offer some background on the actual history of the genre in the country. So I guess anyone can jump in with their knowledge, but let's start with Ren. Could you offer a bit of a crash course in Japanese hip hop for anyone not familiar?
Sure. We'll go top to bottom. And I'm really, really sorry for any Japanese hip hop fans if I skip over your favorite rapper, because there's quite a lot in the 38 years or so, I think that's definitively in the history of Japanese hip hop. I think the where Japanese hip hop started exactly is a point that's debated a lot, but a point that's used pretty often is the movie Wild Style, which was produced and directed by Chick Ahern, depicting sort of the Bronx and hip hop, dance and graffiti. You had the Rocksteady crew, Zoo Nation, Grandmaster Flash. They showed that in 1983 in Japan, and that sort of really inspired this sort of hip hop culture movement, sort of led by DJs, specifically DJ Crush and a Japanese DJ, DJ Yutaka, who is actually a part of Zoo Nation as well. Really sort of bringing hip hop to the forefront. You also have people like Hiroshi Fujiwara, who's known both as a designer and sort of the godfathers of hip hop in Japan. Really bringing in what they're seeing in the U.S. to Japan. You start to have a lot of artists come out of that. At the same time, 1986, you also have Run DMC perform in Japan for the first time as well. And in '88, you have sort of the first major Japanese hip hop label come about, which was started with Hiroshi Fujiwara as well, called Major Force, which was a sub label of Sony, and that's where sort of Japanese hip hop started to gain its roots. And coming out of that, as hip hop started to become more popular, there's a group called Shitadarapa, who had a song called Konya wa Boogie Baku, which is known as sort of one of the biggest sort of Japanese hip hop pop hits that came out in 1994. But sort of what started to happen around that time is you start to see this sort of bifurcation within Japanese hip hop, of sort of this very very serious, lyrically driven hip hop, and then you have this sort of pop leaning hip hop, and you start to see the genre split pretty significantly. And this is very much captured in 1996, when at the Hibiya Open Air Concert Hall, you have sort of these two major hip hop sort of festivals. The first one being called Sampin Campu, which is sort of the, I guess for lack of a better term, sort of Woodstock equivalent of Japanese hip hop in 1996, where you have people like Rhyme Master, Ken Ghidorah, Buddha Brando, Rampai, Shaka Zombie. So sort of the sort of OGs of Japanese hip hop, all perform there, and sort of you have the Kohais, or sort of the next generation of sort of lyrically led Japanese hip hoppers come out of that. And so, through these sort of, you have Sampin Campu, and you also have LB Nation as well, or LB Daierubi Matsuri, which is, you have these big, which is sort of more in the sort of pop genre in terms of the festival itself. And so you have this sort of birth of these sort of very lyrically driven rappers, and then you have this sort of pop leaning genre. But the issue is at the time, you have sort of this tug and pull between sort of the pop and sort of the, I guess the authentic, as they would describe it, hip hop. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of the sort of more pop leaning hip hop gets swallowed up into the greater J-pop genre, and you start to see sort of the was considered sort of the authentic hip hop at the time sort of get pushed further and further underground. And especially at that time, what, in terms of where the money flows are going from the record labels, it's going towards what is selling in the karaoke boxes, what's selling CDs, and what is acceptable on the on the main stage, on TV, so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of hip hop, really good hip hop that comes out sort of in the mid 2000s, late 2000s. People like Dio, Dengaryu, Namedaruma, but they don't get a lot of notoriety in Japan sort of in that time frame. And so from a sales perspective, sort of the late 2000s is considered a bit of a lull. And sort of going into sort of the early 2010s, what happens is really sort of social media and the internet. And so, you have this new platform for distribution around these sort of young emerging artists. And sort of the catalyst behind that is freestyle battles. And so there's a show called Freestyle Dungeon that was on Asahi TV. You also have the Koko Rap Seishiken, which translates to the high school rap context, which is also televised and also shown on YouTube. And so, through this sort of social media context and sort of the shareable content, you see a lot of these young artists start to emerge. And what's really interesting about this generation and sort of the generation that's come out of this hip hop sort of freestyle era is sort of the roots behind sort of the current generation of rappers, is that because they aren't really stuck in sort of this early 80s, early 90s, 2000s dogma of what hip hop is supposed to be, you end up seeing sort of a much broader diversity of rappers. I mean, you still see sort of the very lyrically driven rappers that sort of are reminiscent a little bit more of sort of the 80s and 90s hip hop, but you also have, as sort of Kayvan mentioned, the sort of trap melodic rap genre that starts to emerge. And so, you sort of fast forward to today, you have sort of these, broad subgenres within Japanese hip hop that have now grown up through social media. The record labels have started to pay attention, and some of the artists that have come out of this sort of internet-driven generation have started to sign with the major labels. And sort of what I would say is we're at the beginning today of sort of the mainstream in terms of which way will it go. Will it be become part of the greater sort of J-pop ecosystem, or will it grow into something else entirely? And so I know that was sort of a lot in a little sort of few different places there, but that's sort of the beginning to today.
I think condensing 30 years of history into about 5 minutes, that was pretty good. So thank you.
I was gonna say it kind of mirrors the start of like hip hop in the US as well. Like, honestly, you telling the story of how Japanese hip hop is starting, even the divide between like a more pop leaning rap style, and then in the 80s it was gangster rap, and that was the thing that overtook and became like more of the mainstream sound. So like if you look at it that way, it's like so similar. Like, it almost feels like the beginning of hip hop in the US to an extent.
Well, one of the things that obviously Japanese rap, and honestly Japanese music in general, needs to do is find a way to go abroad, appeal to international listeners. I wanted to ask Aya, first off, what are examples of Japanese pop culture or culture in general that have successfully exported themselves to the global stage? And what do you think Japanese hip hop can learn from these industries? Is there anything specific they should be looking at?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's definitely, there's no denying, I think Japan has been quite a successful exporter of culture. I mean, like, dating back to the 90s, when I was growing up, we have the anime, manga, games, fashion, Nintendo, Pokemon, huge, which is really interesting because, having grown up in the US, I think, although like things are gradually changing now, back then generally didn't consume a lot of culture from non-English speaking countries, and especially not Asia. And so I would say the fact that there, are quite a few Japanese cultural exports that everyone can name is quite impressive. And even, into more recent years, like, we're seeing a lot of Japanese exports still make their way into America from, this like minimalist fashion of Uniqlo, that whole life-changing magic of tidying up boom. That being said, I think music is actually one area where Japan hasn't really been successful. Like so much so that I think if you're not living in Japan, it's really hard to believe that it has the second biggest music industry in the world. And the industry is really different. It focuses on like physical sales, CD sales, and I think in general it doesn't really translate well, and I'm talking when I say music industry, sort of the mainstream pop, it doesn't translate well. I think like it seems, in terms of language, literally, because a lot of there's not a lot of English accessibility, but I think also culturally, I think like, Japanese idol culture, for example, doesn't really translate well to the US. It seems very perplexing to foreigners. I mean, I am Japanese and it's still very perplexing to me. And I think, these like big acts also are really slow to integrate streaming services. But and just generally the success of sort of these mainstream Japanese artists trying to break out in the US is pretty low. And I think that like some people might say that Japanese artists don't have interest in going abroad. I don't think that is true. I think that, you know, playing overseas, having foreign fans, being able to export is you know, major, you know, career cred. If they could, they would. But I think generally when it comes to these exports, I think when it comes to music, they're much more likely to find success within like a genre rather than pop, rather than mainstream, which is, you know, the reason why we have these like mainstream artists, like I was talking about with last time in our conversation we had on Clubhouse, like these mainstream artists like Hikaru Utada, who in the eyes of Japanese people are like big global stars, but they really haven't made a splash in the US for the most part. But meanwhile, I think like more genre specific artists like Nujabes, or, you know, which I like to use as an example, was like one of the pioneers of this genre of lo-fi hip hop that's really quite popular in the US. So I think going back to the question of what this means for hip hop, I think the good news for hip hop is the music that or you know that tends to be successfully exported tends to be within a genre rather than like this mainstream or pop. And so I think that that sets up hip hop quite nicely, actually, and for a multitude of other reasons, which I think we will talk about later. And I don't know if Frankie or Ren or if either of you guys want to elaborate a little bit more on how it relates to hip hop.
Yeah, I could talk a bit more to like, there's this, so Ren and I had sort of like recently written about this and sort of really like tried to put that, all of our thoughts and thinking and condense them into sort of like points that I think you were really hitting on, Aya, that like you can succeed as a musical artist in Japan and do like very well. Like it's such a big industry there that it's sort of self-sufficient, not self-sufficient, more so within like knowing how difficult it is to break out overseas. Working within Japan is great enough. Ren had already mentioned the sort of pressure or sort of indication to like make music that'll play well at karaoke boxes. The sort of huge CD and collector culture in Japan that's still very prevalent is sort of a different way for the internet born and the younger sort of generation of hip hop artists who perhaps have an interest in producing physical records, but are not sort of coming up in the same mold as previous ones. And then you think of like, America is of course the birth of hip hop and the central place, but it's also where artists, you know, with the explosive rise of Latin trap, but also where like Canadian, British, foreign artists of all sorts are trying to also break into the American market. How does like all of the sort of barriers sort of therein, and like it's a crowded space. And that's just also not even considering American artists who are also trying to sort of make their way within the scene as well. So with hip hop artists in Japan, so like what we've touched on of like the similarities that the genre shares between the two countries, between America and US, what we've seen is like ways to break in is to sort of tap into the new ways that people are consuming or engaging with music, and a lot of that is digitally. And that was sort of exacerbated by the pandemic, by like needing to rely on, like you couldn't quite go to a record shop as often as you could previously in Japan. So you would have to go and see like streaming has sort of like grown, and we've seen like between, you know, top players like a SoundCloud or Apple Music, but then also, you know, your Japan specific platforms or SoundCloud, even that's where we've seen the sort of growth. And that's where like that sort of discovery, like Ren going down to YouTube sort of wormhole happens. And with sort of, you know, lo-fi beats to study and chill to has grown. It's like popular in the States, but it comes from a place where like similarly I see hip hop artists getting thrown into that sort of mix that the algorithm is sort of picking, and sort of realizing that there is an interest there, both in Japan and stateside.
We have a few more minutes left before we open up things to questions. So I wanted to sort of end by looking specifically at some of the artists that Frank Renaissance is going to be working with in the near future. And also just in general, like if any of you guys have recommendations for Japanese rappers people should listen to. Let's start with Ren. If you want to talk a little bit about the artists Frank Renaissance is working with right now.
Sure. Yeah. So we're working with a few different artists today. First one is a producer named KM. He seems to be producing most everybody's tracks in Japan today. But the idea that a producer can and beat maker can transcend language, and his beats are also, Kayvan's been helping us connect with artists on the US sides and have gotten some really great reception as well. Another artist we're working with is an artist named Daichi Yamamoto, who is actually a half Japanese, half Jamaican rapper, who great thing about him, one piece is that of course he does speak some English, and so he does put English in his lyrics in a way that a global audience can understand. But from a musical style side of things, he can really range from more sort of trap pop leaning to sort of the track we plan on putting out with him soon is more sort of club disco leaning to stuff that's more lo-fi hip hop. And so really great diversity to the type of music he puts out, and just a really great story with him as well. Another artist is an artist named Young Dalu, who's also half Filipino, half Japanese, more in sort of the melodic pop sort of trap genre, but also just really, really smart guy, and has his aspiration. The first thing he told me is that he wants to be like Travis Scott on the Coachella stage. And so, I think we'll see what that looks like in the sort of post-COVID world. But would love to help him try to achieve his dream. Another one is Sick Boy, who is sort of this punk rock rap, sort of emo rap sort of genre. And he, I would say of all the artists in Japan last year was sort of the best-selling artist from a sort of this generation of internet-driven, sort of social media-driven hip hop. And so there's a few others that we're working with, but it just gives you a bit of a flavor of who we're working with today.
Does anyone else have any suggestions to, I'm not to get ahead of the questions, but I think the most popular question is like, who should we be listening to? So if anyone else has any recommendations, let's like jump in. Kayvan, who would you recommend?
I'm a fan of a couple different people. So I really like Lex, who also is kind of like more in that like melodic trap line, a little bit more in the melodic trap line. He kind of like, I would compare him to Travis Scott. I think that is a good comparison. He makes music that Travis Scott would make in Japanese. I really like it. It just sounds really good. It's really enjoyable sonically. I also really like Yellow Bucks, who is he raps in English and Japanese, which is really cool. He doesn't necessarily lean as heavily trap influenced, but I just really love that he raps bilingually and does like a really good job of it, and it just sounds great. Sick Boy is somebody I'm a fan of. Like I really actually am psyched that we're doing stuff with Sick Boy, because I'm really like a fan of his music. Leon Fanorakis, who is like a younger guy, but is super cool. Like I really just discovered him like recently, and I went to like a rabbit hole of just like listening to everything that he put out. And then, yeah, I think those are really the main ones right now. I know that Ren has sent me a couple people that were just like really tight that I've really been enjoying as well. So I'm starting to dive just headfirst into finding more artists as well on the Japan side, and trying to find stuff that maybe people don't know about yet.
Frankie, Aya, any last recommendations you want to put in there?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I mentioned we talked about Weni earlier, and I'm half Filipino, and so seeing artists like Weni or Young Dalu that Ren mentioned, who's also Filipino, there's a lot there too. I love sort of like, as I've grown to embrace my own sort of Asian American heritage and identity, like to see and have met like these rappers over there. It was like surprising to me, at least on first blush. And then like, as I got to know these guys and see more rapper, like their work, being half Filipino in Japan was really spoke to me. But then there's also like Nene of Yurahura Gang, and like she's just like really, really cool. And like having seen her live in Tokyo and seeing that sort of energy, and that very much like as a screenshot could have been a show with the energy she had sort of, the two of them had brought together on stage, could have been a show here in the States. But the crowd's a little different, a little bit of a sort of like, everyone gets their own, everyone's a little bit politer at a hip hop show in Japan. But then there's a group like, I think Patrick, you know them, like Underhairs, who I think those girls are crazy, and I forget where they're from in Japan exactly, but they do something like really different and talk about like, well, the sort of narratives of some of their songs is very much about like oneself, one's body, and sort of like things like messaging and like language you don't really hear much in sort of music kind of generally. And then I think there's one other artist, and I don't want to really like say the name incorrectly. Sort of my Japanese is very, very, very limited, but like Haruru Inu, and she's just sort of a female rapper who's doing something like would love, like these are artists we'd love to sort of work with and bring to the sort of Frank Renaissance family, because all the ones we work with are people we really like enjoy working with, collaborating with, and helping their careers grow.
Awesome, cool. I think we are at the point where we can open things up to questions. I mean, yeah, and a quick glance was everybody wants to just know these names. Can I hear them on streaming? So I'll try to update the chat with names that we just mentioned. But yeah, let's go to the Q&A. So where to start? One sec. All right, let's start with a question from Caleb Benjamin. This one's specifically for Kayvan and Frankie due to their media backgrounds. How does the growing momentum of hip hop scenes around the world, both Japan and beyond, how does that impact the future of entertainment, advertising, and marketing?
I don't know. I know Caleb. Caleb, this is a tough question. We talk about this a lot. I mean, I think it just opens the door. You know what I mean? Like, I think brands are aware that different markets have power, and they're starting to see that when it comes to spending money, and especially on like campaigns with media companies like Genius. And we're starting to see the rise of companies wanting to market to Latinx audience specifically, and so they'll be wanting to work with Spanish speaking artists and artists who are really big in those markets first and foremost. Same thing on the Korean front as well. So I think it opens the door, and I think like if you can build the community and the fan base to an extent where it is like arguably already where it is with J-pop, right? Like that is massive, and the artists that are at the peak of that like are arguably bigger than some of the artists who are in the top 10 on the Billboard charts in the US. You know what I mean? Like they arguably have a much bigger and much more engaged audience who's willing to spend more. So I think like at the core of it, it opens the door, and the door is open at least on the US side. And I think brands are starting to realize like, oh, like maybe we should be a little bit more focused on music globally, because we can do the same things that we're doing with US based artists and reach these markets that we weren't reaching before.
Exactly. I think, Caleb loves to ask like the most poignant, exact questions. I think there's something where you go outside of the US and then you see like a familiar face, and it's like a celebrity, some sort of actor or somebody, but they're like doing an ad. You see a giant poster for them doing like for like a backpack brand or furniture, or a luxury brand even. So there's a lot of like celebrities have a long history of doing ads in Japan. You might not see them be doing in the States. And I think with the growth of hip hop though in particular, we'll see what sort of started when like Pharrell and Kanye went to Japan, and it like blew their mind, and they brought it back and it informed their work that they were doing back in the States. That like, so that the generations of American artists really love going to Japan and doing and exploring and experiencing what's over there, and that this hip hop scene, it's just a matter of time before they connect more concertedly. And of course that's what we aim to do. But I think we're going to see stuff where like when you see these sort of crazy advertisements, or just sort of impressive and stunning ones, both in Japan, the hip hop scene there and the energy of the artists and their stories and all that they sort of bring will sort of carry over stateside for things, whether it's content, media, or brand work as well.
I think also just to add to that as well, like there's a lot from Japan that is already consumed within US, like especially within hip hop too. Like there's so much that's already connected. Like even going back to Pharrell and Nigo and like Bape, and like the embedding of Bape is like it's like a brand that people want all the time. You know what I mean? I think there's so many instances of that. Like if you look at like Y3 too, like again, like that is like super tied in with hip hop, and streetwear in general is tied in with hip hop, right? So there's like all these opportunities, especially on the fashion side of things, where these artists are really looking, at least from the US side, to have more of an impact in Japan as well. So there's just I don't know. There's a lot of doors that open with us kind of like being like, all right, let's collaborate and figure out the ways that we can bring value to both sides. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers that question.
To your point, Kayvan, too, around sort of, and I know, apologies, Caleb, you asked this to Kayvan and Frankie. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of sort of this intersectionality between hip hop, I mean, hip hop is, of course, there's the music, but it's all the culture around it. And so, you know, of course, there's the intersectionality with fashion, but, you know, you look at, Rui Hachimura in the NBA today, you know, on the Wizards and doing well. You know, and actually, interestingly enough, basketball, you wouldn't think it is actually the most played sport in middle school and high school in Japan. But the intersectionality between music and basketball isn't quite explored at the same scale as LeBron and 2 Chainz collaborating on an album together. And so I think sort of this broad intersectionality across genres, if explored further, can really help the hip hop genre grow, you know, within Japan, but also outside of Japan.
A lot of people in the question and answer section are sort of bringing up K-pop, you know, sort of how K-pop and to a degree Korean hip hop as well, they've found pretty big success in not just the American market, but the global market. And they're curious how, basically, how did they do it, but Japan hasn't? And what can Japanese hip hop learn from that? You know, you guys mentioned 88 Rising, who have primarily worked with Chinese hip hop artists, Indonesian hip hop artists, among others from across the continent. So I guess, yeah, what can you learn from the successes of both these sides?
I think the biggest thing that you see from the K-pop side is honestly the label support. Like I don't know that it's necessarily the music is. All right, this is gonna be a little bit of shade, not a ton of shade. There's gonna be a little bit of shade.
Let it out.
I don't think that the music is that groundbreaking, if we're being honest, right? Like if you look at it from like a macro level, like you're looking at pop music throughout the 90s and the 2000s in the US, the groundwork of what's being done is basically the same. Like it's not that drastically different than what we saw with NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys and those artists like at that time, like when I was a kid growing up, right? I don't think it's that different musically either. It's just the modern version of that. So, I really think the biggest difference and really the reason that it's been so big globally is just the marketing efforts have been massive from the labels and they've done it the right way. And there's been a focus on digital first and foremost, right? Which I don't think the Japanese labels have really done, especially with hip hop in mind. But it feels like, at least from conversations that I've had with the guys here, is that the Japanese labels tend to operate on maybe like an older model versus the Korean labels, which have kind of taken the old model and just brought it into the 21st century, brought it into 2021. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's really the major difference. But I do think that the biggest plus side for us on our side is that there is just so much more about Japanese culture that is already built into hip hop culture in general. And there's just so much intersectionality between it already. And you just don't really see that with Korean culture necessarily and hip hop specifically. And so, like, I don't know, for me, that I think is probably one of the biggest things. I just think that the support has been there from an infrastructure standpoint for these Korean artists. And I just don't think that the Japanese artists are getting it in the same way. And I don't think the focus is the same. Whereas, like, you'll see BTS being really billed as like the main artist throughout. Like, even if they do collaborations with artists across in the US, like BTS is the focus, right? And these groups are the focus. And I will say, I think they have a harder time breaking smaller acts too. Like, it's like, you take arguably the biggest pop group in the world, right? And you bring them to the US, probably like you're gonna have a good time. But building something up from like a smaller level and trying to bring like maybe a baby artist who's not as big and doesn't have as much weight in the US, even for me, is like booking talent for like Genius, right? Like it's hard for us to be like, all right, let's take a risk on something that is completely unproven from a group that like isn't necessarily as big and doesn't have this built-in audience. So I don't know. I really think it's just like the infrastructure aspect of it that's really been the driving force for Korean music to like be such a global force, and then the lack of it on the Japan side.
I wanted to ask that first, actually, because another question that's come up multiple times, and I think this is an important one as we kind of near the end of this talk today, starting with Taiga Ishibashi sent asked us, what are points Japanese hip hop should fix in order to reach a wider fan base? And that's referring to the fact that in K-pop, and this is true of K-hip hop and also 88 Rising, they've had a lot of incidents where, they've been accused of cultural appropriation. There's been a lot of, problematic moments. That also led to a question from Arama Japan's own Ronald Taylor, who asked, how do you deal with the issue of race and culture and cultural appropriation when bringing Japanese rappers overseas? So I guess anybody who'd like to speak on this, how do you approach that? And how do the artists themselves kind of deal with it?
Delicately.
Yeah, I mean,
Please elaborate.
God, you want to go for it, or should I go for it? Okay. I think these are two very big, distinct questions of what does Japanese hip hop need to do, or in this case, fix, in order to reach a broader audience, and how do you deal with the issue of race and cultural appropriation? But I actually think that they can be answered in a relatively similar way. One phrase I've heard within the hip hop community in Japan that I think makes you feel like it's a significant risk within the hip hop community is that they say "kuru wa daizente," which means you have to look cool first, in essence, or be cool first, and that is a given. That is something that goes with all hip hop, and I think that's extraordinarily problematic because cool is something that the greater audience and society sort of determines. It's not necessarily something that the artist determines, in my mind. And so, for example, there's a video with a group that we sort of a group called the Normcore Boys that we know that I know that they grew up down the street from where I live here, and they're in a video like shooting guns in the music video. And I think that sort of thing where it doesn't come from a place of authenticity. It comes from a place of what's cool, and there's a disconnect there. I think that can be extraordinarily problematic. And so really, and I think also, especially when trying to be cool, what I've seen with a lot of hip hop artists, some hip hop artists as well, is that they start to sort of, there's a regression to the mean, in a sense, where they start to there's a sense of convergence. And I don't think this is that different than American hip hop as well in some ways, but especially pronounced in Japanese hip hop, especially in Japan, which is, there's a lot of, it's very much a collectivist culture in a lot of ways. And so, my thought is, I think, especially working with some of the artists that we started to work with today, really taking, maintaining authenticity, but also taking a step out of the comfort zone to do something that, maybe is not something that is sort of obviously cool in Japan, but also could, shows who they are in essence. So, long story short, I think, there's always going to be a group, people who, say, just the sheer fact that they're doing something in hip hop in and of itself is intrinsically cultural appropriation. But, and I think you can't really avoid that, but, while staying authentic and being sensitive and aware, I think you can thread the needle to some extent while reaching a broader audience. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think there are a lot of great questions that I am afraid I don't think we'll be able to get to as our time runs out right now. But I guess this is a good point to say farewell. First off, though, where can people learn more about Frank Renaissance? Where can they go to follow what's happening with you guys?
You can follow us at Frank Renaissance. Oh, here we go. There you go. There are all the links. Perfect. So yeah, so you can follow us on our social media channels on Instagram and Twitter. Also, any questions around Japanese hip hop or any interest in learning more about what we do, any interest in collaborating, feel free to email us at info@frankrenaissance.com. We're also putting out a monthly playlist as well called Frank Renaissance and Friends. And so you can get a look into what's going on in Japanese hip hop today. And so yeah, definitely reach out anybody who's interested, and you'll be seeing some more of us over the next few months.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much again for everyone tuning in to today's conversation. And yeah, everyone from Frank Renaissance, whether they're in New York or waking up early here in Tokyo to chat.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
thank
Thank
you.
you.